Good afternoon. My name is Linda Levy, and I'm director of JDC's Global Archives. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, and we're thrilled that so many of you have joined us for this afternoon's program. Just a quick word about the JDC Archives. The JDC Archives holds the records of the JDC since its creation about 106 years ago, visiting scholars from around the world, as well as publishers, journalists, filmmakers, family researchers, curators, and others, use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in the JDC Archives. Our program today deals with the multifaceted work of JDC in North Africa from the 1980s to the 2000s through the reflections of two of its country directors, former country directors. First, Dr. Seymour Epstein, Epi as we call him, and Yechiel Barcaim, who will each give a presentation. The program will conclude with 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off and we will take questions through the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the lecture. Our first speaker, Dr. Seymour Epstein, is originally from Toronto. He has been very active in formal and informal Jewish education throughout his career. After working at the United Synagogue Day School in Toronto and teaching at McGill University in the 1970s, Dr. Epstein moved to Morocco in 1981 to become JDC's education consultant in Casablanca. He later became JDC's country director for Morocco. Then he moved to Paris and served as JDC Director of Jewish Education, serving actively in Western Europe and the former Soviet Union. He then joined JDC's former Soviet Union team as a country director and served as the Director of Jewish Education across the FSU. Following his work with JDC, Dr. Epstein directed Toronto's Board of Jewish Education at UJA Federation and published a book on his JDC fieldwork. He now consults in the field of Jewish education and community planning. Epi will now give his lecture.
Good afternoon, good evening to some. And thank you, Linda, for the introduction. I can talk about Morocco for days, but I will attempt to give you a taste in the 20 minutes allotted me. In the 1980s, I was at first a pedagogic consultant and then country director in Morocco, as you heard. I served in two postings, 1981 to 1983 and 1986 to 1988. After that, I continued to consult the Jewish education in Morocco and elsewhere throughout the 90s. When I arrived in Casablanca in August 1981, there were approximately 15,000 Jews left in the country, considerably diminished from the approximate 250,000 in 1945, depending on who you ask. I came originally on a 2-year contract to consult to the 4 existing school systems, Otzar Torah, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which in Morocco is called Ittihad, Lubavitch, Chabad, and Ort. Near the end of that contract, the country director, Mo Levine, of blessed memory, a legendary joint veteran, left prematurely, and I was appointed country director. It was my boss and mentor, Ralph Goldman, Alav Shalom, who warned me that if I wanted a JDC career, I needed to become a generalist, not just a Jewish educator. I must have listened since I stayed on for another 16 years. In all foreign NGO work, there will always be a dialogue between the authority of the NGO and that of the host country. It was Ralph Goldman who alluded to this dialogue by constantly asking the question, Mi Samcha, who appointed you? Echoing the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verse 14, where a Hebrew slave asks Moses, who made you chief and ruler over us? Mi Samcha. The dialogue is one of culture, values, priorities, and policy, sometimes out in the open and many times unspoken, sometimes a bit of nasty conflict, other times calm and settled by compromise. I'd like to introduce you to the community by showing you some significant dates, then briefly explain the scope of JDC activity in the 80s and illustrate some of the tension of competing authorities in some of our program activity. Please show slide 1 of the PowerPoint. There we have some dates. We'll go through them quickly. In the first century of the Common Era, Jews started arriving in North Africa. There's a good chance that they were coming even before that, according to some scholars. These Jews who arrived early on met with the local inhabitants who were Berbers, and these Jews were called Toshavim, the settled ones or the settlers. Of course, in the 7th and 8th centuries, there was the Arab conquest of the Berber territories. Some Berbers who converted to Judaism became Muslims, some didn't and stayed Jewish, and there was now a population of Jews living with, for the most part, Muslim Berbers, and of course, conquering Arabs. In 1492, and probably before somewhat as well, and into the early 16th century, the Spanish Jews started arriving from the Iberian Peninsula because of the exile there. These Jews were referred to as Mugurashim, the exiled ones. And to this day, Moroccans are either Toshavim or Mugurashim. In 1860, to jump ahead, the Alliance began its work in the Mediterranean basin and of course came to Morocco and started opening up schools and exerting a kind of French Jewish influence in the country. By 1912, the French Protectorate began and lasted till 1956. That was a period when Jews had both a relationship with the Moroccan natives and with the French government. 1945, there were, as I said, about 250,000 Jews in the country. These dates are important. 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, that's when a large contingent of Moroccans, especially from the rural areas and the mountains of the High Atlas and the Middle Atlas and the Sahara, left for Israel. Independence, 1956, was another time when Jews had questions about the future. The death of Muhammad V, who was a friend of the Jewish community and protective of the Jewish community during the Holocaust, another time when there was some question because it wasn't clear how his son would respond to the Jewish community when he took over. That was Hassan II. 67, 73, wars in Israel, times of some tension in the country, and again, questions asked about whether Jews should stay or leave. My period in the country is, as you heard, 81 to 88. At that time, there were approximately 15,000 Jews left in the country. Again, in 99, with the death of the king, Hassan II, there were questions about the future. But interestingly enough, with this new king, Mohammed VI, there was in 2011 a passage of a constitutional referendum mentioning in a complementary fashion the Jewish presence in Moroccan life, both past and present and future, a sense that the Jews really were a part of the country and the culture, which is the case. The joint was involved in formal and informal education, that is schools, camping, and youth groups, also welfare, which included food, clothing, monthly cash assistance, health, which was mainly support for the Ozay, a clinic in Casablanca, and care for the aged, small homes in some provincial towns at that point, and a large home de vieux, an old folks' home in Casablanca. Our financial support was always a percentage of the total cost, the rest covered by the community or the school system itself. And as the community diminished and weakened, the JDC share, of course, increased. We provided consultative support as well, an example being my very presence there as a pedagogic consultant to the 4 school systems in 1981. Let me give you some examples of competing or even conflicting authorities. My first story came from Rabbi Benjamin Gorodetsky, the Chabad Lubavitch emissary for France and North Africa during my tenure. We got to know each other quite well. He told me of an early encounter in Tunisia, not Morocco, with their Jewish schools of the time. This would be in the early 50s. Basically, Chadarim for the boys. In class after class, he noticed that each group had children of various ages from small to tall. He told the local rabbi that he had a better, kind of Western way of organizing the classes and rearranged the learning groups by age. The local rabbi, immediately moved certain boys around, more or less, back to the earlier situation. Rabbi Gorodetsky questioned the moves and was explained that this boy's teacher is the son of his father's teacher, and that this boy over here is studying with the same teacher his father had. It all stays in the family. Gorodetsky looked at me with a smile and said, maybe they had something there. So that's an example, really, of two very different ways of creating a classroom. And in this case, the ancient Tunisian way winning out. Please show slide number 2. This is all about teachers' salaries. When I arrived in Casablanca, the JDC had just set up an agreement with the Moroccan government to purchase local currency at a reduced rate. This meant that our dollar budget was worth considerably more in country than when budgeted. The windfall had headquarters instructing me to prepare a proposal for increasing teachers' salaries in the school systems that we were partially funding. Before computers, this was mostly done with pencil, a calculator, and graph paper. The schools little resembled anything that I had encountered in North America, and the teachers even less so. But after many visits and meetings with principals, I wrote a proposal for New York. The exercise was actually quite beneficial to me, since it introduced me to both the complex differences from what I knew and the diversity among the 4 different school systems operating in Morocco. As I said, Otzar Torah, the Alliance, Ort, and Chabad. It was my first bath in the culture of North African Jewish education. But headquarters immediately rejected my proposal and sent a school management expert from New York to work with me on a revised proposal. This happens a lot between headquarters and field. This man's experience was in the New York public school system. He spoke English only, no Hebrew, French, or Arabic. My language with the principals was Hebrew and French. I translated at all the meetings with principals, and it wasn't only a translation of language, culture as well. My colleague explained that salaries were determined by a simple matrix of training and work experience, last degree, and years of teaching. Sounds simple, n'est-ce pas? When my co-worker found out that many teachers had not finished high school and that some had barely been in a real elementary school, one element of the matrix became unrealistic. The other element, years of teaching, was relevant until one of the principals pointed out that there was a third consideration, which he used to determine salaries and or something like what we would call a bonus. A teacher with a large family received extra salary. An upcoming family celebration, such as a Brit Milah or a wedding, required a significant bonus, etc. Here was the clash of systems between New York and Casablanca. Fortunately, our headquarters expert saw that the system he represented could not function in North Africa, and he supported my original proposal, which was basically a percentage increase on the status quo of each teacher. In retrospect, there was another option. Headquarters could have decided to use the extra money elsewhere in the country budget and leave the teachers with their existing low income. But a balance was achieved, JDC's financial resource with local values. Please show slide 3. This is about the kindergartens. Soon after my arrival, I was informed that our country director was going to be absent when a UJA mission of women's leaders was arriving. I was to host and guide the mission. I knew very little about UJA, less about missions, and even less about Jewish Morocco. The Paris office suggested that the Otzar Torah kindergarten was one of our finest jewels and that it must be on the tour. So I went to visit to prepare myself. When I visited the kindergarten with Rabbi Aaron Montenegro, Zichrono Livracha, the director of Otzar Torah, and later to become the chief rabbi of Morocco, I was shocked to see a picture of Jesus in the room. I asked the rabbi what he was doing there, and he pointed out that a picture of a shepherd was suitable for the tiny children, and he wondered how I knew it was Jesus. which never occurred to him since Christianity barely exists in Morocco. I assured him it was Jesus and strongly requested him to take it down for the visit of the mission. That and also the picture of the Marlboro man smoking. Rabbi Montenegro always wondered how a JDC consultant knew what Jesus looked like. It was the halo. In this case, I imposed our Western perspective, but for a higher good. Slide 4, please. One morning, as I entered the JDC office, my staff informed me that a resident of the Jewish Home for the Aged was dying. And that's what this picture is of, the home. I think this is sometime on Pesach, I'm not sure. This was a woman I knew and had talked to occasionally. I rushed over to the home and saw that the woman had been moved to the infirmary and was in respiratory distress. I asked if the ambulance was on its way to bring her to a clinique, a private hospital that we used. I was told that no ambulance had been ordered, monsieur. Elle est mourante, she's dying. Why take her to a hospital? I insisted. They followed my instructions and she died in the clinique a few hours later. I was the foolish Canadian who knows nothing about life and death. Slide 5, please. This is the last slide, a classroom, more or less from the time I was there. After a few months of observing classes in all of the schools, I noticed that some lower grades had older children sitting in the back of the room. When I asked about these children, it became apparent that they were kids with various forms of learning disabilities who were frozen into one grade, usually without any real progress. There was as yet no tradition of special education in the country. A group of women who were connected to one of the schools encouraged me to form a group of these students for some special attention. There were no special educators in the community, and I had no training or very little training in that domain. I found a mother who spoke French, Arabic, and Hebrew, and together we came up with some teaching strategies for these children. I had to convince the schools to cooperate by releasing these children to one class. The only authority I had was that of common sense and compassion. JDC had to find the funding in our budget for this class, and the principals had to open themselves to a new idea. We had some small success and a few sad failures, but we worked basically on hope. While I hoped for a bit of French reading skills and some simple arithmetic, our very worst child, a young boy, made no progress. All we could do was to give him a win. And in order for him to have a win, we had to teach him a chapter of Song of Songs in Hebrew so that he could join other boys who sang it in the synagogue Friday evening, something that all the men of the community were present at. That first time, he smiled with pride and confidence, a smile I never saw in him before. Once again, a dialogue of different cultural authorities. Special education produced a brief but significant moment of Moroccan liturgy and a proud little boy. Can you close the slides, please? I was in the lunchroom at one of our elementary schools watching the kids eat a delicious meal, a couscous meal, when I noticed that one of the teachers was maintaining discipline with a stick in his hand. I did not witness him using it that day, but when he left it on a table and walked away, an older child picked it up and threatened another student with it. In my then role as pedagogic consultant, I had already wondered if I could speak to the teachers and impose on them my Western views regarding corporal punishment. I hesitated until a parent complained to me about the problem. Even then, I wasn't certain, since the parent claimed that only she had the right to hit her children. Finally, I had seen too much and decided to talk to the teachers about corporal punishment. Given the traditional background of the teachers, I thought of quoting some sacred Jewish sources from the Talmud, but I realized that some of them were quite capable of citing alternative sources which recommended the very thing I was opposing. I gave the talk without quoting the Talmud or the Bible, and there was no opposition. The next day, though, one of the teachers came to my office and told me how much he agreed with me and assured me that he never hits a child for bad behavior, only for incorrect answers. That was one of those days when I wondered exactly what I was doing in Casablanca. One of the traits I came to notice in a diminishing ancient community was that of nostalgia mixed with illusion. Nostalgia for a rich and thick past, and illusion regarding the future, colored by that nostalgia. The local board of Ittihad, the Alliance Schools of Morocco, came to me in the 1980s with a proposal to build a Jewish university in Casablanca. As impractical as the idea was in Jewish Morocco of the 80s, it was based on the glorious history of the ANH, the École Normale Hébraïque, their high school, which exists to this day, but in earlier times had produced Alliance teachers for schools throughout the Mediterranean basin. Who knows? Perhaps with the Abraham Accords, such a dream could materialize, but it's doubtful. In conclusion, a final story. One Friday night in Casablanca, my dinner host, Rabbi Aaron Montenegro, Zichrono Livracha, as I told you, director of the Otsar Torah schools and later chief rabbi of Morocco, he asked me if I knew that the Friday evening hymn, Lecha Dodi, was about love. Bien sûr, love is the obvious theme of this 16th century liturgical poem. But Rabbi Aaron was not talking about human love or even about divine love. He stated that this hymn, revered by every Jewish community in the world, was about l'amour municipal, love between two cities. At the time, Tzfat, where the poem was written, 16th century, was prospering as a Jewish city. It was full of students, teachers, halachists, Kabbalists, philosophers, and poets, some of whom were composing new texts and novel customs. Jerusalem, on the other hand, the holiest city of the land of Israel, and much more ancient a city than Tzfat, was not enjoying the same vitality in the 16th century. It was mostly in ruins. According to my host, that Shabbat evening, the poem is the voice of Tzfat, declaring her love and devotion to Jerusalem. And if I just quote you a few lines in English of the text of Lecha Dodi, you'll understand. Sanctuary of the King, royal city, arise. Come forth from your ruins. Too long have you dwelt in the valley of tears. God will show you abundant mercy. The Lord's glory is revealed in you, not me. Do not be ashamed. Do not be confounded. The city shall be rebuilt on its hill. Come, my friend, to meet the bride. Let us welcome the Shabbat together. It was that night in Casablanca that I came to realize that this novel reading of Lecha Dodi was the story of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and its mission. The powerful Jewish diaspora community of North America has been helping other communities around the world, most of them older, wiser, and once richer than American Jewry, but now in need of assistance. In all of my JDC work, I could not engage in helping another community without recognizing both the powerful Jewry which sent me and the hidden strengths of the Jews who needed our help. Thank you.
Thank you, Epi. Our second speaker, Yechiel Barcaim, is a graduate of Harvard, the Sorbonne, and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He began working for the Joint in the mid-'80s in Jerusalem. He was sent in 1989 to Vienna, where he directed the program to care for Jews coming from the then Soviet Union on their way to the West. Later, he was named JDC country director for the small Jewish communities in the countries that were then Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. He later served as country director for Tunisia and Algeria as well. He began work in Tunisia in 1999, representing the Joint as the only American NGO active in that country at that time. Yechiel currently serves as an independent consultant to JDC and to the Bader Philanthropies, of Milwaukee. Yechiel will now give his lecture.
Representing the Joint in Tunisia, 1999 to 2014. I'm delighted and most grateful to have this opportunity to put before you a name and a face behind the Joint's work in Tunisia from 1999 to 2014. I began to travel in 1999 from my home in Paris to Tunisia as the country director for the Joint. Here I was, a 54-year-old, liberally educated, largely secular American Israeli male, with no prior knowledge of, let alone direct contact with, an Arab society. Moreover, my attitudes and professional conduct had been shaped by working with various remnant Jewish communities, struggling to emerge during the post-1989 democratic awakening in Central Europe, and other communities caught up in the wars that split apart the former Yugoslavia. There, the Joint's presence was absolutely critical for all concerned, including for the governments themselves. In Tunisia, however, I encountered a markedly different world, one for which neither my background nor my previous experience had prepared me. First slide, please. From a population of at least 100,000 in 1950, the number of Jews in Tunisia had shrunk to perhaps 1,700 by the time I arrived. But in this case, size did not matter. I quickly found myself dealing with at least 4, and later 6, proud, fiercely independent, and mutually mistrustful Jewish principalities. Each, moreover, had its own particular code of conduct, court etiquette, if you will, that I had to follow. Second slide, please. The official Jewish community of Tunisia was led by a newly elected president, Roger Bismuth, a respected member of the Tunisian Senate. He was surrounded on the governing committee by other successful French-speaking businessmen based in Tunis. The committee's main concern, and the Joint's as well, was to look after the 100 or so desperately poor, frequently totally uneducated, aged and ill Jews remaining in the country. For the most part, these individuals had lacked the personal and professional wherewithal to leave when everyone else did. Also located in Tunis, but totally independent from the official community, was the Chabad School. Founded in mid-century, it was headed until 2007 by the Venerable Rabbi Nisan Pinson, and afterwards by his widow, Rebbetzin Rachel Pinson. By the time I came, they had long made their mark on generations of Tunisian Jews. Slide 3. About 1,000 strictly observant Arabic and Hebrew-speaking Jews lived in their fiefdom of Chara Kabira in Jerba, where they kept the synagogues and yeshivot alive. Having spurned the secular education offered to them by the Alliance Israélite Universelle decades ago, these traditional Jews continued to send their children to strictly religious Jewish schools in Jerba, a small island close to Libya, and Zarzis on the opposite mainland. Thirdly, there was David Kiddushin, who since the middle of the 20th century, with the support of the Joint, had initiated supplementary Jewish education in Hebrew for the girls of Jerba. These girls also attended the mixed public schools part-time. As in the yeshivot in Jerba, these classes were taught mostly in Hebrew. Some of the finer points, however, of Talmud were explained in Arabic, no matter how surrealistic that may sound. The teachers were mostly unmarried girls, only slightly older than their pupils. When these teachers married and had children of their own, as they normally did at a young age, they customarily retired. Later, a breakaway, more demanding yeshiva was created with the help of foreign donors. This yeshiva was totally independent of both the chief rabbi and the official community. And finally, there was the modern but strictly observant Jewish girls' school, Kanfei Yonah, created by two former teachers at the Kiddushim school. Assisted by the local community leadership, the Joint, and others, they introduced the community to a more ambitious school curriculum based on up-to-date pedagogical techniques and taught in modern, fully equipped classrooms. The new school also inspired additional married Jewish women who had become mothers to continue teaching. What was the role of the Joint? In Tunisia, past experience suggested that little was wanted or even expected from the Joint beyond providing truly necessary financial support and enthusiastic approval for whatever was being done. My predecessor, the beloved Evelyn Peters, told me that the heads of the various Jewish principalities were not particularly open to listening to her advice. What did a secular foreigner really have to say to them anyway? And after all, she was a woman to boot. The problem, however, was not hers alone. For 15 years or more, the universally esteemed Ralph Goldman and the international lawyer for the Joint, Daniel Lack, had been periodically coming to Tunis, trying to convince the Tunisian government to compensate the local Jewish community for a highly valuable tract of land that had been confiscated. Alas, their outside intervention only resulted in the local Jewish leaders being rebuked by the authorities, essentially in these words: you'll have to decide. Either you are loyal Tunisian citizens, or you consider yourselves wards of a foreign power, in which case we will know exactly how to deal with you. Thus, the president of the Tunis community soon informed me in no uncertain terms that Messieurs Goldman and Lack should not bother to come anymore. Implied, but never stated openly, the well-connected community leadership had its own means for recovering Jewish property. And to underscore this point, the community proceeded to repay to the Joint over 5 years the $150,000 they had borrowed to build the new Jewish old age home in La Goulette. That was, I'm convinced, the first time any community anywhere had settled such a debt. Dire issues of social welfare. Drawing on American principles of fairness, I introduced, together with the local leadership, objective standards for determining the level of social assistance awarded to each beneficiary. That system replaced the previous one, in which the sums awarded were determined arbitrarily and influenced by personal affinities. To ease the implementation of the new approach, moreover, the Joint increased its support so that we could raise all around the monthly benefits. We also agreed to provide community support to an invalid non-Jewish widow whose late husband had been a Jew. In the strictly sectarian Tunisian environment, extending such help was not to be taken for granted. Why, I was asked, were the Jews of Tunisia not receiving support from the Claims Conference? After all, they had lived for 2.5 years under Vichy rule and then had endured 6 months of direct Nazi occupation. Many Jews had also been sent to forced labor camps in Tunisia to build fortifications for the Nazis. Sometimes they were exposed to enemy fire, that is, Allied bombings. Apparently, some survivors of this wartime oppression had received aid in the early 80s, but that assistance had gone dormant. I immediately commissioned a special report on that history, one that I believe played a key role in the grants subsequently awarded by the Swiss Fund, the Claims Conference, and the Spanish Government Fund. These monies helped underwrite welfare assistance, home care, and medical treatment for Tunisian Jewish survivors of World War II. These allocations also enable the community to directly improve living conditions for the assistees by renovating outdated household utilities and renewing basic home equipment. Given this sudden largesse, I also suggested that all the elderly Jews go through comprehensive medical and dental exams to see what treatment they might need. But Monsieur Bismuth quickly quashed that idea. These people are old and weak, he said. During their entire life, they barely benefited from the most elementary level of medical care, and perhaps none whatsoever from a dentist. You're going to send them to tests that will show that they have all kinds of additional ailments and deficiencies that at present they have no notion of. What for? You'll only frighten them. Poverty, though, was different in Jerba. At a kaparot ceremony one year, I heard from a rabbi that in the past there were always more Jewish families in need than the number of slaughtered poultry he could distribute. Now, however, it was hard to find even a single impoverished Jewish family in Jerba to whom to give a chicken. Slide 4, please. Standards for the Jewish schools. In education, too, there was always the question as to whose standards were to be met, as Epi has illustrated in his presentation. In Jerba, I actually began my duties by unwittingly testing naive American instincts against problematic local realities. The children attending the Jewish kindergarten drank water that came from a well. So I obliged Mr. Kedushim to have a professional laboratory test the water. Of course, the lab test showed that the water was unfit to drink and the well was closed. But Mr. Kedushim protested. These children have been drinking this water for years without ill effects. Their systems are used to it. What do you think you're doing? Whenever we came forward, however, with additional resources to build modern classrooms, buy new desks, or renovate the modest play areas, the joint's modernizing efforts were most welcome. We persuaded Ort International to create a computer lab for the pupils at the Chabad School in Tunis, and the joint itself then introduced 2 computer learning facilities at the schools and yeshivot in Jerba. Even so, our instincts for innovation and reform encountered limits at every turn. For the Chabad School, I arranged for a highly competent and very demanding pedagogical inspector to come from France. Together, we tried to implement certain health standards as well. For example, we thought that children with lice should not be allowed to come to school. Alas, however, we could not make the rules stick. By that time, only the offspring of a few large religiously observant families who had come originally from Jerba were enrolled in the Pinson school. As one father explained, we grew up with lice, and our crowded living conditions, due to our large families, make it impossible for us to get rid of them. Only when scabies broke out at the school were we finally able to take effective action. Cooperating with the founders of the new girls' school in Jerba, Kanfei Yonah, and raising substantial funds for their new building, naturally put a strain on my relationship with the joint's traditional partner, David Kirushim. But it was always the joint's responsibility and practice to work simultaneously and without prejudice with all the different parts of a community. Even so, David, to his credit, persevered in treating me as an honored guest every time I came. Slide 5, the one showing Tunisian Jewish food, which David served to me every time I came. Relations with the larger society. In the broader Tunisian context, Jews were tolerated at best. If they sought medical care in a public hospital, for example, Tunisian Jews could expect to be abused by their fellow patients. Hence, the joint, the communities, and Jewish families themselves almost always paid for private hospital care. In Jerba, many of the Jewish children attended mixed Arab and Jewish public schools for half a day before or after their classes at the Kiddushim school. Separate Jewish schooling for girls in Jerba became a full-time necessity, however, once Middle East political tensions boiled over in the early 2000s. When refugees fleeing the civil war in Libya sheltered at the airport in Jerba, I suggested to the Jerba community president that we offer oil, sugar, and flour in assistance. Upon learning of the offer, the Libyans consulted among themselves. Do we accept help from Jews? After a brief delay, the answer came back. Hell yes, we accept help from anybody. None of this ambivalence, however, prevented the Jewish community president in Jerba from playing cards regularly late at night with his close Arab friends, including the police chief of nearby Humsuk. Of course, such informal ties also proved quite useful whenever the need arose. Despite this complex and deeply problematic context, I felt a responsibility to extend the joint's help to the general society, especially because we were the only American NGO then operating in Tunisia. Next slide. The only place where I could find Arabs, Berbers, and Jews together, however, besides the prisons, was a center in Jerba for youth with mental disabilities. More than 70 Arab and Berber young adults attended the center daily, plus one daughter of the chief rabbi. We started modestly and cautiously by helping the young people raise a dozen sheep. And I was heartened to see even the poorest Arab parents living in the desert participating in the project and bringing olive branches as food for the sheep. Then, at the urging of the director of the center, we raised our sights. I found the funds necessary for the center to purchase a farm of 2.7 acres, an act which in turn galvanized further donations from both Muslims and Christians. Even the government was ready to recognize this farm work as vocational training worthy of public support. This incredibly exciting, inspiring, and fruitful interfaith project collapsed suddenly, however, when the director of the center, the key person leading the effort and promoting our cooperation, was deposed. As someone more seasoned than I was at the time could have anticipated from the outset, the main candidate in the following board elections promised categorically that once elected, he would remove the Jews from the project. Afterwards, the very same new chairman told me that if the joint wanted to submit a proposal to continue to help, the new board might deign to consider it. Politics and security. The Tunisian government had long instituted certain security measures to protect Jewish institutions. But on April 11, 2002, an Al-Qaeda terrorist crashed a small truck carrying a fuel tank into a building just opposite the famous La Griba synagogue in Jerba. 16 tourists were killed, as well as 3 Tunisian workers. The autocratic Tunisian president at the time, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, immediately saw to the necessary repairs and created a well-guarded perimeter for the synagogue compound. When the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia, toppled Ben Ali in 2011, however, the new democratic authorities thought at least the Jews in Khala Kabila, now to be regarded as equal citizens for the first time, should no longer receive extra security protection. Subsequent events on the ground, however, soon put to rest such utopian fantasies, and the same discreet protective arrangements from before were quietly restored. Next slide. What did I learn from working in Tunisia? As an American and as an Israeli, I used to think that the truth and its opposite could not coexist. The ideal to strive for when communicating with others, moreover, was always to be as frank and direct as possible. Working in Tunisia, however, I learned to sense just how mysterious and multifaceted the truth could be. I also found out how to respect the value of indirectness. I had to cultivate the skill of well considered imprecision, even of communicating through a third party when necessary. In a society where maintaining good personal rapport counts for so much, such a softer, less assertive approach lowers the risks for all concerned. In conclusion, for all the significance of what the joint has done and still does, we tend to have exaggerated notions of our own importance. The bee pollinates many flowers and makes delicious honey from what he gathers, but it is the trees and the flowers themselves that create the next generation. Thanks to our modern Western outlook, our advanced education, our broader view of the world, and most particularly the considerable resources we have at our disposal, we, the representatives of North American Jewry, can and should deliver well focused, unbiased assistance wherever we intervene. And yet, we all need to take a back seat to the local leadership, which over millennia has preserved and protected Jewish life in such a difficult environment. I found it an exciting and deeply moving personal and professional experience to observe, share in, and even contribute to the life of the Jews of Jerba. On that small desert island, an ancient and yet still vibrant, highly traditional society, deeply committed to its own Jewish values, continues to develop in the face of many adversities. With the exception of Jerba, however, not enough young Jews are growing up in Tunisia today to provide a future generation of leaders. Please remove the slides. Finding the personal and professional maturity required to function effectively in a starkly different society is a true challenge. Learning the hard way how to meet it was the only option I found. No matter how psychologically crushing it can be, one is obliged to accept that there are walls and boundaries in life one cannot cut through, or go around, or climb over to get to the other side. Individuals who have grown up and still live in relatively open societies, like you and me, can have trouble coming to terms with such harsh realities as I found in Tunisia. My personal conclusion is that we need to push ahead nonetheless, while affirming what I call the essential 7 Rs. 1. Respect. Recognizing the personal and historical context in which you find yourself and the struggles over centuries of those whom you have come to help. 2. Rapport. Creating the ties of mutual respect and friendship that will enable you to work cooperatively with others whose life experience is far different from yours and who live in what to you is and will remain an unfamiliar society. 3. Realism. Taking, nonetheless, an unblinking look at what is to be faced, not letting preconceptions, slander, wishful thinking, and or simplistic assumptions color your perceptions and analysis. 4. Responsibility. Understanding in what ways your intervention is needed and appropriate, and embracing your role accordingly. 5. Resilience. Hanging on to your energy and self-confidence, no matter what reverses you encounter, nor what obstacles lie in your way. 6. Resolve. Galvanizing your determination and your capacity to persevere towards achieving shared goals. And finally, 7. Resourcefulness. Finding within yourself and together with the other persons who share your vision what is called in Hebrew tushia, the courage, and the inventiveness required to find the best solution. And if all that is not enough, one has to achieve everything that I've mentioned, all at one and the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Yechiel. Thank you both for two fascinating talks. We're now going to open the floor to questions. I want to remind you that your microphones are turned off and we will take questions via the Q&A function. I'd like to begin with a question comparing the two countries and the two communities. Tunisia and Morocco are both situated in North Africa, not very far from each other. Could you tell us a little bit about how different the two communities are? Who would like to begin?
Look, I can start. Clearly, very different because, as you heard, the Moroccan situation, I think, is probably somewhat older in terms of its organizational structure, but also Morocco is much more traditional community than Tunisia, primarily, and not only amongst Jews, but amongst the majority Arab and Berber populations, who are Islamic. And that has to do with it being a kingdom. The fact that it's a kingdom and that the king is incredibly powerful and very popular as well explains why, for instance, there was no Arab Spring in Morocco, or very little of that, and how it started in Tunisia. And I'm sure that Yechiel has other differences that are obvious.
Okay, well, I think in Tunisia, the Jewish community had been hollowed out by voluntary immigration, also by certain discriminatory measures taken under the Bourguiba reign going back to the 50s and 60s, and also just the attraction of studies and careers abroad. So it's very hard to speak about Tunisian Jewry in the period that I was there as a whole. That's why I mentioned the principalities. I was in Morocco once, and I did have the feeling that the kingdom, the royal organization put walls around the society, whereas in Tunisia, the resentment against the dictatorship meant that everything was sort of open and uncontrolled when this Arab Spring came. Even though Tunisia is probably the only Arab country so far to have made somewhat of a success out of the Arab Spring, even if the economic difficulties continue.
Thank you. I see we have a number of questions. A few of them deal with education, and I think I'm going to lump a bunch of questions together. We have one question about let's see, were the schools in Morocco Jewish only? Another is, why did Chabad have a major presence in Morocco as early as about 1950, and why more in Morocco than in Tunisia?
I can jump in and answer the last one.
Okay.
You have to ask the Rebbe Milubavitch.
Yeah,
He was the one who sent these East European rabbis first to Morocco and then told Rabbi Pinson, as one of the first shlichim in this, what has become a worldwide phenomenon, who sent Rabbi Pinson to Tunis.
and in terms of the schools, all of the schools except one were completely Jewish in terms of the student population. One one of the Alliance schools, actually by now, two of the Alliance schools admit non-Jews as well. Very few in one and more in another. But the schools were very much Jewish environments. And one of the strange things was that when you went to the central market in Casablanca, many times an Arab merchant would call out to you once you were identified as a Jew in Hebrew, because that particular merchant had attended an Alliance school as a child and learned Hebrew, and probably learned it a little better than some of his Jewish friends. So that it was, but for the most part, the schools were populated by Jewish students. Chabad came to Morocco in the early 50s in force. There were three Chabad families, and two of them are still represented by wives in the country. And they constitute, as the leadership, as the rabbinic leadership of the Moroccan community diminished, and the very, very best and most powerful rabbis left for France or Israel, and some to Montreal, Chabad took over certain duties that had to be taken care of. One of them in Morocco that was very important to the community was kashrut. Everything that had to do with kosher meat and kosher wine was really supervised by Chabad, with, of course, with local help. The people who actually did the work were Moroccan Jews, knowledgeable Moroccan Jews. But the ultimate rabbinic authority, even though there was a chief rabbi, came from one of the the Chabad emissaries.
I might add that since the death of Rabbi Pinson 14 years ago now, and the departure of his widow to France, and the total shrinking of the enrollment in the Chabad school, that really Jerba, which always supplied the chief rabbi, remains as the rabbinical authority, or what's left of it, in Tunisia.
Next, we have a question. What influence does the expatriate Tunisian and Moroccan Jews living in France or Israel have on the two Jewish communities left?
Well, I can respond to that right away. The major influence is that they greatly expand the population in summertime. They come to visit from Paris, from Marseille, and from Tel Aviv, and from Bat Yam, and from all over Israel, and even from Quebec, to spend time with relatives or with memories. And a population of 2,000 Jews now suddenly becomes a population of 3,000 or 4,000. There's a tremendous amount of tourism by Moroccan, probably not children born in Morocco, but children born of Moroccan parents that come back for tours of Morocco. These days, you can hear a tremendous amount of Hebrew when you walk into a hotel, the larger hotels, because there's just so many Israeli tourists. And now with improved relations and what will be direct flights, that's only going to increase. So but that's one thing. The other thing is that there is still some business interests and things like that, but not much more than that. There's, as I said, a tremendous amount of nostalgia for the past, and Moroccan Jews all over the world recognize the fact that there was a good life there that needs to be remembered.
I would repeat much of what Epi has said as far as Tunisia is concerned. One of my failed efforts was to get the French Jewry to support some of the welfare needs in Tunisia. And except for one very fine psychologist from Marseille, who took it upon herself to come regularly to counsel the residents of the old age home, I got nowhere. The one exception, and it's an admirable exception, is that the new girls' school in Jerba, we helped them set it up on the condition that they would get their operating expenses from German Jews abroad. And there's also a breakaway yeshiva there that is also supported from outside sources. So I think the solidarity of the strictly religious community is there and remains influential. And of course, Jewish tourism is incredibly important to the economy of Tunisia. And you could see things to excess at Pesach time when whole caravans of Jews from France would make their entry into some of the resorts.
I'm going to combine two other questions here. How do you feel the situation for those Jewish communities has changed in the past 4 years? You may not know. And what is the current situation vis-a-vis security, Jewish life, etc.? And the second question is, what is the level of anti-Semitism in both countries today? I know it's been a while since both of you worked in North Africa. From what you know, would you like to comment on this?
I can say some things. First of all, Jerba is still there. It's still safe. People who have panicked over the years, during the Arab Spring, there was talk in the Israeli Knesset, we have to come with a few planes and evacuate all of them. Surprisingly or not, they remain secure and stable and a growing community, a growing, thriving Jewish community. Anti-Semitism is a given. That's not, we don't need special events to remind anyone that the Jews associated with Israel, or also as money lenders without being forced to become money lenders, there's a long history of resentment and tension, and that exists to this day, and I don't think anyone should have any illusions about it. But it's possible to live with that and, in a sense, to concentrate on the value of your own Jewish life rather than get upset by what other people think of you.
I really, the only contact I have now is with tours that I take there, and we've never had any incidents with Jewish tourists coming in of any kind of anti-Semitic attacks or incidents. But there really is a difference in the age level of the population. Anybody over 60 has very clear memories of a thriving Jewish community with very good relations with their neighbors and the majority culture. And people under 60 have been influenced by pan-Arab nationalism, by resentment against the Zionist entity, the state of Israel, etc., concern for Palestinians. And I would say that there is that distinction, but again, it doesn't manifest itself in open anti-Semitic activity to any great extent. I think in all the years that I lived there and that I worked there and I visited, I had only one incident once that smelled a little anti-Semitic, and that was really very minor.
I wanted to add one more thing, that as a general rule, Tunisian culture, Tunisian society is so warm, so friendly, so open, that whatever people may think of Jews in private, they are, with the exception that I spoke of, incredibly welcoming and friendly and supportive.
Question for you, Epi. What influence did the Jewish economic advisor to the kings have on the status of Jews in Morocco?
Well, mainly one of pride. There was great pride in the fact that André Azoulay was there. He wasn't really the court Jew. The court Jew, of course, was the president of the community who could have a relationship with the king or with the crown in some way. But he was a real advisor, not representing the Jewish community, but there was, of course, great pride in his own personal attachment to Essaouira and the Jewish past of Essaouira, a town that has one Jew left in it altogether. But his concern about reconstructing the Mela and a kind of shrine to the Jewish presence of Asuera. All those things give local Jews and also Jews in Paris and elsewhere great pride. I have a very fond memory of the one time that I met with His Majesty King Hassan II on a mission. At the end of the mission, seeing Monsieur Azoulay and the king walk together away from the group down the beach from one of the king's palaces and conferring with each other. It was a very moving thing. I didn't have a camera at hand, or I would have taken a picture. It was really one of pride. Has he helped the Jewish community? I don't think there's any doubt that his presence in the palace was of great assistance from time to time.
I think we're going to end with one final question in the spirit of Epi's comment now. I'm going to ask you each to tell us what memory is most dear to you of your time in these wonderful communities.
My. I guess I should start because I started the session. There are so many. One of them was that one I just mentioned. But I think some of the time I spent in the summer camps that we ran in Imuzer were some of the most memorable of all. I have a very clear memory of Rabbi Aaron Monsenego, Zichrono Livracha, bringing cherries for the camp from Sefru. Sefru is a nearby town, very famous Jewishly with no Jews left, but it's the cherry capital of Morocco. And he managed to get a huge bushel of cherries and insisted on washing them himself for the children. And I have this, every time I wash cherries, I think of Rabbi Monsenego rinsing off these cherries and offering them to these were the poorer children of the community who were at our summer camp. And that sort of stayed with me forever.
I want to mention two experiences. When I would go to Jerba, David Kiddushin would have me for lunch. And then afterwards, he would assemble the teachers in his school, which was maybe up to 20 teachers, young girls, and have me speak with them. And we would start with questions about the school. But here I was, a non-religious adult male, speaking to young women who did not have this opportunity in their own community. And I ended up giving them advice about how to have a happy marriage and things like that. And for all the gaps between me and the culture there, it was just so fulfilling to feel accepted in that way. And I also want to add that during that entire 15 years, Roger Bismuth, the president of the community in Tunis, was very standoffish, very formal. I was the representative of the joint. He was the president of the community. And if I spoke to the familiar to with everyone else, I was always vous for him. And then I stopped being the JDC country director. And he reached out to me and we became great friends. We stayed with vous, but we became great friends. And when unfortunately he passed away, I went to his funeral in Denmark, actually, and frankly helped some of the people there with the funeral service. But these two moments of acceptance in this such a foreign society have always meant a great deal to me.
That's great.
Thank you so much to both of you. I hope everyone has enjoyed our program today. Our next webinar will take place on September 13th. We're taking a break until September. Dr. Anat Kutner will speak about the role of JDC in the rehabilitation of Cyprus detainees in 1946 to 1949. The lecture will be followed by a fascinating presentation by Sigal Harari Zonder on the artworks and crafts created by the Jewish detainees during their time in the British detention camps in Cyprus. We will be sending out invitations to those who are signed up to our mailing list in August. And you're also able to register for the program via the JDC Archives Facebook page. We hope that you have enjoyed today's program, and we look forward to having you join us in September as well. Thank you all.